Hello, my name is Jasmine Correa, and this is my project, The Deadliest Day. For this project, I wanted to focus on something current. So I will be taking a look at COVID-19 data over the period of 100 days, culminating on January 20th, 2021. I will be using hierarchical clustering, which I will refer to as H clustering, and k-means clustering to visualize the data of 114 countries. Why? The last 12 months have been a challenge and a catalyst for changes in many things in life that we took for granted, from personal space to workspace to learning. So I decided to work with COVID-19 data in order to visualize the broader picture of the reality that we have currently been living in. Why January 20th specifically? Well, January 20th was the day that will go down in history as one of the worst days in the history of epidemiology. It was the day with the most reported death due to COVID-19 worldwide. In the US alone, 4,406 people died due to COVID-19. To put those numbers into perspective, uh, on just really how impactful that number is, uh, we could take a look at the numbers that previously held the number for the highest death toll in a single event in a single day prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, on December 7th, 1941, we had Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor had 2,403 confirmed deaths. On June 6th, 1944, World War II D-Day, there were 2,500 deaths confirmed for the United States. On September 11, 2001, during the September 11 attacks, we lost 2,997 people. And on September 16th, 1928, the Okeechobee hurricane of 1928 took the lives of 3,000 people. COVID-19 took the lives in the United States in a single day of over 4,000 people on January 20th. Because January 20th was such a devastating day, I decided to take a look at the route we took to get there. First, I clipped the data that I had originally obtained. I wanted to be able to use only significant data. So I eliminated the countries who had less than 100 deaths in the period of 100 days that I had chosen, which was the 99 days prior to January 20th. That took the number of countries down from 190 to 114. I excluded 76 countries that accounted for 1,300 deaths. That is to say, around 17 deaths per country, less than one death every 5 days. Each country removed made up about 0.01% of the total data. The largest of those countries was Bahrain, which had 86 deaths over a period of 100 days. It's important to note that because this is a visualization of solely the daily amount of death, they are not weighted in against their population. So some of the countries excluded may have had a high death rate of death versus population, but were insignificant in the overall number of deaths. Here in this graph, we can see a plotting of the total deaths per day starting on October 13th, 2020. The total reported death count on October 13 was 3,983 for a total cumulative death toll of 1,086,922 up to that date. Now, in the next, so in the period of the next 100 days, on January 20th, there were 17,904 total reported deaths due to COVID-19, which kicked up the total of death from 1,086,922 to 2,082,339. Here we can see how over the span of those 100 days, the average rate of death was increased almost 4 times, nearly doubling the amount of total deaths worldwide. Not a single event had claimed so many lives in the last 100 years in such a short amount of time, with the exception of World War II, which had a death toll of 60 million people over the span of 6 years. I wanted to use unsupervised learning to visualize the data of 99 days, or the 99 days that led to January 20th. I wanted to cluster countries by death toll and be able to visualize my findings. So first I created a graph to see how many clusters would get me the division that I wanted. Normally one tends to choose the number of clusters here above the shoulder because the remaining clusters would accommodate very little data. However, because I had already eliminated the data that I consider insignificant, I decided to include as much information as I could. But in I wasn't entirely sure that I wanted to use all 10 clusters. It felt a little too inclusive. So I needed to look at how the partition of countries would look before I decided to use 3 or 4 clusters or 10 clusters. Um, I put at this point I put a pause on k-means. So what I ended up doing was I moved on to H clustering first because I wasn't entirely sure of the clustering choice that I was making. I decided to use H clustering first to create a dendrogram to visualize the data. Once I had the dendrogram in front of me, I was able to understand better the problem that choosing 3 or 4 clusters would impose. Here we can see that because the US, Brazil, and Mexico made up so much of the data, they were in classes in of themselves. I wanted to be able to split up the cluster of countries right here in the middle as much as I possibly could without creating too many individual clusters. 9 clusters was a number that I deemed ideal, but unfortunately it was not enough to split the countries in the middle. 9 clusters gave me 2 small clusters, 6 medium-sized clusters, but 1 huge cluster of 82 countries. So this part right here in green in the middle was almost unchanged. So I settled on 10 clusters, which was a little bit more than I wanted, but it split up that segment of 82 countries in almost half. Once I settled for the clusters I wanted to use, I ran the algorithm for k-clustering and I split up the countries into 10 different clusters and then graphed each cluster and found their average rate of change for those 100 days in order to try to understand why they were paired together. Details of those will be attached in the paper version of the project. One of my initial hypotheses was that countries that were near each other geographically and had similar population would probably have the same amount of death over the period of 100 days and thus show very similar growth. This is shown to be somewhat true in the following figure. Here we can see how the countries in Africa all belong to nearly the same cluster. In this case, cluster number 8, which also included Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Afghanistan, amongst others that are not as geographically close to African countries as they are from each other. Cluster 8 had an average rate of death of almost 5 deaths per day for that period of 100 days. This was the cluster with the most countries and the least amount of death over the span of 100 days. Here we can observe cluster 8 with a little more detail. And while starting on October 8th at different amounts of death, all of the countries went up at a very similar rate. Some of the countries in the clusters do not belong to the same geographical area at all, like Ireland and Afghanistan. If you look at them individually, we can see that Ireland starts at 1,830 deaths on October 13. And on January 20th, it kicks up all the way to 2,768 deaths. Afghanistan, on the other hand, starts a little bit lower at 1,482 deaths on October 13 and goes up all the way to 2,346 deaths on January 20th. So Ireland had an increase of 9 deaths per day, an average of 9 deaths per day, and Afghanistan had an increase of an average of 8 deaths per day. So while it's absolutely impossible to state that all of the countries in the same geographical area will belong to the same cluster, or that countries with the same average rate of death will belong to the same geographical area, it is definitely interesting to see how true that was in some, if not many instances. What I found most interesting, however, was the following. Once the countries were split into clusters, I graphed both the impact of each country on January 20th and the impact they had on death count over the period of all 100 days. The result, as you can see here, is remarkably similar. Here, the gradient of blue shows which countries had the most deaths per day based on the highest count, which was 4,406 deaths in the US. And on the right, we can see the graph of the death over the period of 100 days based on the highest count of total death, which was 198,057, again in the US. And we can observe that on both categories, the US led very, very prominently. The dark blue is almost the same hue. Alternatively, we can see that while the impact on January 20th of Russia and India was not so pronounced, the death toll over the period of 100 days was much more significant compared to the neighboring countries, which also goes to show that while January 20th was the deadliest day worldwide, it was not the deadliest day in many countries. January 20th was the single deadliest day of COVID-19. It was a day that will be remembered as one of the worst days in epidemiology for decades to come. However, it was also the day when the world turned the corner on the pandemic and things started to get better little by little. Thank you for your time, and I hope this information was as interesting to you as it was to me. And I will answer any questions in the comment section below.